Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here chilling in my cozy little corner of the internet, ready to dive into some absolutely wild romantic stories that people have shared on Reddit. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank all of you once again for the immense support on the channel. I can't believe we are about to hit 1,000 subscribers. Not even 5 days ago, I asked you guys to help me hit 100 before the year's ends, and now we're about to hit 1,000 by the end of July. Since you guys really love these videos, I will continue to narrate and post more since you guys really do deserve it. There are so many of you from around the world that stop by to listen to help you focus, fall asleep, or do whatever, and it honestly blows my mind to see where these videos are going. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Anyway, enough of my yapping. Tonight we're reading some of the most heartwarming, bizarre and downright unbelievable stories of how couples actually met, because let's be honest, the real world is way more creative than any romance novel could ever be. So grab your favourite drink, get comfortable, and let's see what kind of chaos Cupid has been up to. Our first story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the universe has a very twisted sense of humour. I never believed in soulmates until I met my husband in the psychiatric ward of a hospital. In 1989, I was 23 years old and had been struggling with severe depression after losing my job and my apartment in the same week. My family didn't know how to help me, and honestly, I didn't know how to help myself either. The darkness felt so heavy that I couldn't see any way out. I remember the day I was admitted I was wearing this ridiculous yellow sweater that my mum had bought me, thinking bright colours would cheer me up. I felt like a walking contradiction, sitting in that sterile waiting room, surrounded by beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like ghosts. That's when I saw him. David was sitting 3 chairs away from me, reading a worn paperback copy of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I thought was either the most ironic thing ever or the most perfect thing ever. He had this messy brown hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and these incredibly kind eyes that seemed to actually see people instead of just looking through them. We ended up in the same group therapy sessions, and I was immediately struck by how he listened to everyone with this genuine attention that I'd never experienced before. When people shared their stories, he didn't just wait for his turn to talk, he actually absorbed what they were saying and responded with thoughtfulness that made everyone feel heard. The first time we really talked was during art therapy, which sounds cheesy, but bear with me. We were supposed to draw our feelings, and I had created this abstract mess of black and grey swirls that looked like a tornado. David looked at my drawing and said it reminded him of Van Gogh's Starry Night if it had been painted during a thunderstorm. Instead of making me feel worse about my chaotic artwork, he helped me see that there was something beautiful in the darkness. Over the next few weeks, we became friends in that intense way that only happens when you're both at your most vulnerable. We talked about everything: our fears, our dreams, our completely irrational hatred of hospital jello. We played cards in the common room, and he taught me how to play chess, even though I was terrible at it. He said it didn't matter, because the point wasn't winning, it was having something to focus on. Besides the noise in our heads, I started looking forward to seeing him every day, which was the first time in months that I had looked forward to anything at all. We would sit by the window in the recreation room and make up stories about the people walking by outside. He had this way of finding humour in everything without making light of the serious stuff we were both dealing with. 3 weeks into our stay, David was scheduled to be discharged before me. I remember feeling this panic, that I was going to lose the one person who made that place bearable. The night before he left, we snuck out to the hospital courtyard after lights out and sat on this bench under the stars. He told me that meeting me had reminded him that connection was possible, even in the darkest places. He wrote his phone number on a piece of paper torn from his journal and made me promise to call him when I got out. 2 weeks later, I kept that piece of paper folded in my wallet and looked at it every day like a talisman. When I was finally discharged, I was terrified to call him. What if the connection we had only existed in that weird bubble of shared crisis? What if he had moved on, or decided I was too much baggage? But I called him anyway, and his voice on the other end of the line sounded like coming home. We met for coffee at this little diner near his apartment and talked for 6 hours straight. It was like no time had passed at all, except we were both healthier and more ourselves than we had been in that hospital. We took things slow because we both understood the importance of taking care of our mental health first. But over the months that followed, we built something real and solid together. We learned each other's triggers and coping mechanisms. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks. We went to therapy, both individually and together, because we understood that love alone couldn't fix everything, but it could make the work of healing feel less lonely. David proposed to me 2 years later in that same hospital courtyard where we had sat under the stars. He said he wanted to return to the place where we had first realised that our broken pieces fit together in a way that made us both more whole. I said yes before he even finished asking. We've been married for 29 years now, and people always ask us how we knew we were right for each other. The truth is, we didn't know anything for certain back then. We were both messes trying to figure out how to exist in the world, but we knew that whatever came next, we wanted to figure it out together. We learnt that sometimes you don't find love when you're at your best. Sometimes you find it when you're at your most real. David still reads to me when I'm having bad days, and I still beat him at chess even though he taught me how to play. We've weathered job losses, family deaths, financial stress, and our own ongoing mental health journeys. But we've done it all together, and somehow that has made everything bearable. I know it sounds crazy to say that a psychiatric hospital was the most romantic place I've ever been, but for us it was where we learned that love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who sees your incompleteness and chooses to stay. Anyway, that story just proves that love really can bloom anywhere, even in the places where you least expect it. There's something beautiful about two people finding each other when they're both at their most vulnerable and building something lasting from that foundation. Let's move on to our next story, which takes a completely different approach to finding love. I met my wife because my dog got her dog pregnant, and she called me absolutely furious about it. This was 3 years ago, and I still can't believe this is how our love story started. I had just moved into a new neighbourhood with my golden retriever Max, who I thought was the most well-behaved dog on the planet. He never ran away, never caused trouble, and always came when I called him. So when I let him out in my fenced backyard one morning while I made coffee, I didn't think twice about it. About an hour later, I heard this banging on my front door like someone was trying to break it down. I opened it to find this woman with wild curly hair, wearing paint-splattered overalls and holding a leash attached to the most beautiful golden retriever I'd ever seen. She was clearly upset, and before I could even say hello, she launched into this tirade. "Excuse me, is that your dog?" She pointed toward my backyard, where Max was sitting innocently by the fence. "Because your dog somehow got into my yard, and now my dog is pregnant, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do about this. I have never had to deal with puppies before, and this is a complete disaster." I was completely taken aback, because first of all, Max had never escaped from our yard, and second of all, this woman was simultaneously the most angry and most attractive person I had ever encountered. She had these bright green eyes that were shooting daggers at me, but also this energy that was completely captivating. I apologised profusely and asked if we could figure out how Max had gotten into her yard so we could prevent it from happening again. She marched me around to the back, where we discovered that the previous owners of my house had apparently removed a board from the fence and just leaned it back in place, so it looked intact but could easily be pushed aside. As we stood there looking at the makeshift fence repair, I realised I didn't even know her name. "I'm Jake, by the way," I said, extending my hand. She looked at it suspiciously for a moment before shaking it. "I'm Sarah and this is Luna." She gestured to her dog, who was now sniffing around my yard like she owned the place. Sarah explained that Luna was a purebred golden retriever who she had been planning to breed eventually, but not yet, and definitely not with some random neighbourhood dog. No offence, I told her, none taken, and that I understood her frustration. I offered to pay for any veterinary costs and to help find homes for the puppies when the time came. She seemed surprised by this offer, and her anger started to deflate a little. She admitted that she was mostly upset because she felt overwhelmed and unprepared, not because she was actually mad at Max or me. We ended up talking for over an hour about dogs and neighbourhoods, and life in general. I learned that she was an artist who worked from her home studio, which explained the paint on her clothes. Over the next few weeks, I checked in on Sarah and Luna regularly, bringing groceries and offering to help with anything they needed. As Luna's pregnancy progressed, Sarah and I spent more and more time together. We would sit in her backyard, watching Luna sunbathe while we talked about everything and nothing. I found myself looking forward to these visits more than anything else in my week. Sarah had this way of seeing the world that was completely different from mine. She noticed details I missed and found beauty in things I would have walked right past. She was passionate about her art and her dog and this community garden she volunteered at, and listening to her talk about the things she cared about made me want to care about them too. When Luna went into labour, I was the person Sarah called. She was panicking because it was happening faster than expected, and her regular vet wasn't available. I rushed over with Max, and we spent the entire night helping Luna deliver 6 healthy puppies. It was messy and exhausting and absolutely magical. Sitting on Sarah's kitchen floor at 3 a.m, surrounded by newborn puppies and holding cups of coffee, with shaking hands from exhaustion and adrenaline, I realised I was completely in love with this woman. I had met under the worst possible circumstances. She was covered in various fluids. Her hair was escaping from its ponytail in every direction, and she had never looked more beautiful. I think Sarah realised it too, because when our eyes met over the pile of sleeping puppies, she smiled at me in a way that made my heart stop. We didn't say anything. We just sat there grinning at each other like idiots, while Luna cleaned her babies. We started dating officially after the puppies were weaned, and we had found homes for all of them, which took about 3 months. During that time, we saw each other every day, and I got to watch Sarah transform from a stressed-out soon to be dog grandmother into this confident, nurturing person who handled the whole situation with grace and humour. A year later, I proposed to Sarah in the same backyard where we'd first discovered the broken fence. I had Max carry the ring in a little pouch attached to his collar, and when Sarah opened it, she started crying. She said yes and then immediately started laughing, because she realised Max had planned this whole thing from the beginning by breaking through that fence. We got married last fall, and Max and Luna were both in the wedding party. Max wore a bow tie, and Luna wore a flower crown, and they walked down the aisle together, like the proud dog parents they had become. People always ask us how we met, and Sarah loves to tell them that our dogs had better game than we did. Looking back, I can't imagine meeting Sarah any other way. The chaos and stress of that first encounter showed me exactly who she was under pressure, and I loved what I saw. Our relationship was built on problem solving together and taking care of something bigger than ourselves. And those are still the foundations of our marriage today. Plus, we kept one of the puppies, a little guy we named Cupid, who has Max's adventurous spirit and Luna's intelligence. He's living proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances. Sometimes the universe really does work in mysterious ways, and apparently sometimes it uses unplanned dog pregnancies as its matchmaking service. I love how they turned what could have been a disaster into the foundation of their entire relationship. Our next story proves that timing really is everything, and sometimes love happens when you're not even looking for it. I met my husband at the grocery store when we both reached for the last pint of Ben & Jerry's fish food at exactly the same time. This sounds like something out of a romantic comedy, but I swear it actually happened, and it changed my entire life. It was a Tuesday night around 9 p.m, and I had just finished the worst day at work. I could remember I was a nurse at a busy emergency room, and we had been understaffed and overwhelmed for weeks. I had been on my feet for 14 hours straight dealing with one crisis after another, and all I wanted was ice cream and my couch. I was in the frozen food section of the grocery store, still wearing my scrubs and probably looking like I had been hit by a truck, when I spotted the fish food in the ice cream freezer. There was only 1 pint left, and I practically lunged for it, at the same time that this guy in a wrinkled button-down shirt reached for it from the other side. Our hands collided on the container, and we both just stood there for a second looking at each other. I was exhausted, and probably a little delirious from the long day, and instead of doing the polite thing and letting him have it, I just started laughing. Not a cute giggle, but this full-body laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest where I had been storing all the stress and frustration of the day. The guy started laughing too, and soon we were both standing in the frozen food aisle, cracking up over a pint of ice cream, like complete lunatics. Other shoppers were starting to stare, but neither of us could stop laughing long enough to care. Finally, he caught his breath and said, "I think this calls for some kind of negotiation. I'm David, by the way. I'm Claire, and I just worked a 14-hour shift, so I think I have squatters' rights on this ice cream." He pretended to consider this seriously, and then said, "Well, I just got dumped via text message, so I think I have emotional distress claims." We ended up deciding to share it right there, in the parking lot, sitting on the curb next to my car, eating ice cream, with plastic spoons from the deli counter, and talking about our terrible days. David told me about his ex-girlfriend, who had decided she needed to find herself, and apparently that involved finding herself with her yoga instructor. I told him about the patient who had come in, convinced he was having a heart attack, but was actually just having a panic attack about his credit card bill. There was something so easy about talking to him, maybe because we were both at rock bottom and had nothing to lose, or maybe because sharing ice cream with a stranger in a grocery store parking lot was so absurd that all normal social rules went out the window. Whatever it was, we sat there for 2 hours, just talking and laughing until the ice cream was gone and the parking lot was mostly empty. When we finally got up to leave, David asked if he could call me sometime. I gave him my number without hesitation, which was completely unlike me. I usually took weeks to decide if I liked someone enough to go on a date. But something about David felt different. He felt safe and funny and real in a way that I hadn't experienced before. He called me the next day and we talked for 3 hours. We had our first official date that weekend at this little breakfast place that served pancakes the size of dinner plates. He told me later that he had been nervous about what to wear until he remembered that I had already seen him at his worst fighting over ice cream in sweatpants, so there was no point in trying to impress me. Over the next few months, we fell into this easy rhythm of spending time together. David worked as an accountant, which meant he had normal human hours, while I worked rotating shifts at the hospital, but somehow we always managed to find time for each other. He would bring me coffee when I worked late shifts, and I would cook dinner for him when I had days off. What I loved most about David was how he never tried to fix my bad days. He just listened and made me laugh and reminded me that there was a world outside the hospital walls. He had this way of finding joy in small things, like trying new restaurants, or walking through bookstores, or watching terrible movies and making fun of them together. 6 months after our ice cream encounter, David showed up at the hospital at the end of one of my shifts carrying a pint of fish food and a plastic spoon. He said he had something important to ask me, and my heart started racing because I thought he was going to propose right there in the break room. Instead, he asked if I wanted to move in with him. He said he had been thinking about it for weeks, but wanted to make sure I was ready. He didn't want to pressure me, but he also didn't want to waste time pretending we weren't already spending most nights together. Anyway, I said yes immediately, and we ate the ice cream to celebrate. We moved in together 2 months later, and it was like we had been living together for years. We had the same taste in furniture and movies we both liked. The apartment cold, and we were both neat freaks who did dishes immediately. after eating. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. David proposed to me a year later in the same grocery store where we met. He had convinced the manager to let him set up a little display in the frozen food section with flowers and a ring and a sign that said, "Will you marry me, Claire?" The Ben and Jerry's fish food was arranged in a heart shape around the whole thing. I said yes before he even got down on one knee. We got married 6 months later and had our wedding cake made to look like a giant pint of fish food, complete with chocolate fish swimming around the layers. It was ridiculous and perfect and exactly what we wanted. People still ask us how we knew we were right for each other, and the answer is that we didn't know anything for certain. What we knew was that we could laugh together, even when everything else was falling apart. We knew that we could share ice cream on a curb and feel like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. We knew that love didn't always look like what you expected it to look like. Sometimes it looked like two tired people fighting over frozen dessert and deciding to make the best of it. We've been married for 8 years now, and we still keep a pint of fish food in our freezer at all times, just in case we need to remember how we started. We've learned that the best relationships aren't built on grand romantic gestures. They're built on small moments of choosing each other again and again, even when you're tired and stressed and fighting over the last ice cream in the store. I love that story because it shows how the most ordinary moments can become extraordinary. When you're with the right person, sometimes the best love stories start with the simplest shared experiences. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that sometimes the most unlikely places can lead to the most beautiful connections. I met my wife at a blood drive, and our blood bags literally touched each other, which sounds weird when I say it out loud, but at the time, it felt like the most romantic thing that had ever happened to me. I had been donating blood regularly for about 5 years, ever since my little brother needed a transfusion after a car accident, and I realised how important it was to have donors available when people really needed help. The Red Cross had set up in the community centre gymnasium, and I always went to the same donation events because they knew my medical history and it made the whole process faster. That particular day in March, I was running late because of a work meeting that went long, and when I got there, most of the donation beds were already occupied. I was directed to one of the last available spots, right next to this woman with auburn hair who was reading a book while her blood was being collected. I'm usually pretty quiet during donations because I've learned that some people get nervous about the needles and the blood and don't want to make conversation, but something about her seemed so calm and composed that I felt comfortable saying hello. She looked up from her book and smiled, and I noticed she had these incredible hazel eyes that seemed to change colour in the fluorescent lighting. We started talking about what we were reading. She was working through some dense philosophy book that I had never heard of while I was rereading Harry Potter for probably the 10th time. She didn't make me feel stupid for my choice in literature. Instead, she said she envied people who could reread books they loved because she always felt compelled to move on to something new. About halfway through our donations, the volunteer came by to check on us and accidentally bumped the little rolling stand that held our blood bags. The bags swayed, and for just a moment, they touched each other, clinking together like wine glasses in a toast. The volunteer apologised and moved them apart, but the woman next to me started laughing. She said, "Well, now our blood has officially met, so I guess we should probably introduce ourselves properly. I'm Amanda, and apparently my blood is very social." I told her I was Chris, and that my blood was usually more reserved, but seemed to be making an exception today. We ended up talking for the entire rest of the donation process about books and work and travel, and a dozen other things. I learned that Amanda was a librarian at the university, which explained her impressive reading habits and her ability to make literary recommendations that didn't make me feel inadequate. She was funny and smart and had this way of listening that made me want to tell her things. I usually kept to myself. When we were done with our donations, we both had to sit in the recovery area for 15 minutes to make sure we felt okay before leaving. Amanda pulled out a granola bar and offered to share it with me, saying that the cookies they provided were too sweet for her taste. We sat there eating granola and drinking apple juice, like we were at some weird picnic. I didn't want the conversation to end, so when the volunteer said we were free to go, I asked Amanda if she wanted to get coffee sometime. She said she would like that, but suggested we wait a few days, since we'd both just donated blood and probably shouldn't be consuming caffeine on top of that. She was practical and thoughtful in a way that I found incredibly attractive. She wrote her phone number on a bookmark that she pulled from her philosophy book and told me to call her when I felt like my blood volume had returned to normal. I kept that bookmark in my wallet for 3 days before I finally worked up the courage to call her. Our first date was at this little coffee shop near the university library, and we talked for 4 hours without either of us checking our phones. Once Amanda had this way of asking questions that made me think about things differently, and she listened to my answers like they actually mattered. Over the next few months, we fell into this pattern of meeting for coffee or lunch or dinner, and every conversation felt like it picked up exactly where the last one had left off. She introduced me to authors I had never considered, and I showed her movies that made her laugh until she cried. We went to art museums and hiking trails, and used bookstores, and everywhere we went felt like an adventure. What I loved most about Amanda was how she made ordinary moments feel special. She would point out interesting architecture on buildings I walked past every day, or notice the way light fell through trees, or remember tiny details from conversations we had weeks earlier. She paid attention to the world in a way that made me want to pay attention too. Amanda told me later that she had been going to that same blood drive for 2 years and had never talked to another donor before me. She said something about the way I had said hello made her feel like it was safe to put down her book and engage with another person. She had been going through a difficult divorce and wasn't looking for anything romantic, but found herself looking forward to our conversations. 8 months after we met, Amanda needed surgery to remove her appendix, and I was the first person she called when she got out of the hospital. I brought her soup and books and sat with her while she recovered. We both realised that somewhere along the way we had become the person the other one wanted to call when something important happened. I proposed to Amanda 2 years later at another blood drive, the same one where we had met. I arranged with the Red Cross coordinator to have our donation beds next to each other again, and when they brought our blood bags over, I had tied a ring to one of them. Amanda started crying before she even saw what it was, and said yes while we were both still connected to the donation equipment. We got married the following spring and asked our wedding guests to consider donating blood in lieu of traditional wedding favours. We collected enough donations to help dozens of people, and it felt like the perfect way to celebrate the beginning of our marriage by giving back to the community that had brought us together. Amanda and I have been married for 6 years now, and we still donate blood together every few months. We always request beds next to each other, and we always joke about our blood bags touching that first day. The volunteers at the donation centre know our story and always make sure we get paired up. We've learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it starts with 2 people lying on cots in a gymnasium, sharing granola bars and apple juice. Sometimes it begins with the smallest moment of connection that grows into something neither person expected but both people needed. People ask us all the time how we knew we were meant to be together, and the truth is we didn't know anything for certain at first. What we knew was that talking to each other felt easy and natural and important. We knew that we both cared about helping other people, and that we could spend hours together without getting bored or running out of things to say. The blood donation thing has become a running joke in our relationship. Whenever we have a disagreement, Amanda will say that we're compatible on a cellular level, so we should be able to figure out whatever surface level problem we're having. It always makes me laugh and reminds me that we literally have shared blood flowing through donation centres somewhere in the world. Now that's what I call a connection that goes deeper than surface level. There's something beautiful about 2 people meeting while doing something selfless and discovering they have this incredible chemistry. It's like the universe rewarding them for their generosity. Let's move on to a story that proves sometimes the most chaotic situations can lead to the most solid relationships. I met my boyfriend when we were both hiding under the same bus stop during a drive-by shooting, which is probably the most intense first meeting story anyone will ever have. But somehow, it led to the most stable relationship of my life. This happened 2 years ago, when I was living in a neighbourhood that was going through some serious gentrification issues. There was a lot of tension between long-time residents and newcomers, and unfortunately, some of that tension occasionally erupted into violence. I had been warned about staying aware of my surroundings, but I never expected to be caught in the middle of actual gunfire. I was walking home from the grocery store around 7 in the evening, carrying 2 bags of food and thinking about what I was going to make for dinner, when I heard what sounded like firecrackers going off behind me. It took my brain a few seconds to process that the popping sounds were actually gunshots, and that people were screaming and running. My first instinct was to drop everything and find cover, but I was in the middle of a residential block with nowhere obvious to hide. The only shelter I could see was a bus stop about 50 feet away, with those thick plastic walls that might provide some protection. I ran toward it as fast as I could while trying to stay low. When I dove behind the bus stop, I crashed directly into someone who had apparently had the same idea. A guy about my age was already crouched there, and when I basically tackled him, we both went tumbling onto the ground in a heap of arms and legs and grocery bags. I remember apologising frantically while trying to untangle myself, and he kept saying, it's okay, we're okay." The shooting lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. We stayed crouched behind that bus stop for another 10 minutes after the gunfire stopped, neither of us sure if it was safe to move. The guy I had collided with kept checking to make sure I wasn't hurt, and I kept asking if he was bleeding from anywhere. Neither of us had been hit, but we were both shaking with adrenaline. When we finally felt safe enough to stand up, we looked around and saw that my groceries had scattered everywhere during our collision. There were apples rolling down the sidewalk, and a carton of milk had burst open and was creating a small white river in the gutter. The whole scene would have been funny if we weren't both still terrified. The guy helped me gather up what was salvageable from my grocery disaster and introduced himself as Marcus. He had been walking home from work when the shooting started and had the same instinct to find cover. He lived just a few blocks away and offered to walk me home, since we didn't know if the area was completely safe yet. During that short walk, we talked non-stop about what had just happened. We were both processing the shock and fear, and having someone who had experienced the exact same thing made it easier to work through the adrenaline crash. Marcus had this calm, steady presence that made me feel safer, even though we were still walking through the same neighbourhood, where shots had just been fired. When we got to my building, Marcus asked if I was going to be okay alone, and if I had someone I could call. I realised that I didn't really have anyone close enough to call about something like this. My family lived across the country, and my friends were mostly work acquaintances who wouldn't know how to handle a conversation about being in a shooting. Marcus must have seen something in my face, because he asked if I wanted company for a while. He said he didn't want to impose, but he also didn't feel right leaving me alone. When we were both still shaken up, I invited him upstairs and we sat on my couch drinking tea and talking about everything except what had just happened. We ended up spending the entire evening together, watching mindless television and ordering pizza because I couldn't bring myself to cook with the groceries that had survived our bus stop collision. Marcus had this way of being present without being overwhelming. He didn't try to analyse what had happened or make it into something meaningful. He just sat with me while we both processed it. Over the next few days, Marcus checked in on me regularly. He would text to make sure I felt safe walking in the neighbourhood and offered to meet me at the grocery store if I needed to go shopping. He wasn't being overprotective or clingy, he was just being thoughtful, in a way that showed he understood how the experience had affected both of us. A week later, Marcus asked if I wanted to have dinner at a restaurant in a completely different part of the city, somewhere with no traumatic associations and lots of witnesses. He said he wanted to get to know me under normal circumstances, when we weren't both running on adrenaline and fear. I said yes immediately because I had been thinking the same thing. That first official date was perfect. Marcus was funny and smart and had all these interesting stories about his work as a social worker. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my answers, and made me feel like he was genuinely interested in who I was as a person, not just someone he had shared a crisis with. Over the next few months, we built a relationship that was surprisingly normal. Considering how we had met, Marcus had this steady, reliable quality that I had never experienced in previous relationships. He showed up when he said he remembered things. I told him, and he handled conflict with patience and maturity. What surprised me most about dating Marcus was how safe I felt with him. Not just physically safe, although that was part of it, but emotionally safe too. He never made me feel like I had to perform or pretend to be someone I wasn't. He accepted my anxieties and weird habits and bad days without trying to fix them or minimize them. Marcus told me later that meeting me during such an intense moment had shown him something important about my character. He said watching how I had handled the fear and chaos, and then how I had opened my home to a stranger, had made him want to know more about who I was. He felt like he had seen the real me right from the beginning. We moved in together after dating for a year, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We had already been through something traumatic together, and everything else seemed manageable. By comparison, we knew we could count on each other in a crisis, and that foundation made all the normal relationship challenges feel less daunting. Marcus proposed to me 6 months ago in the most peaceful place he could find, a botanical garden full of flowers and fountains and families having picnics. He said he wanted our engagement to be the opposite of how we met, calm and beautiful and full of life. I said yes while sitting on a bench surrounded by roses and sunshine. We're getting married next spring, and we've decided to have the wedding in that same botanical garden. We want to celebrate how far we've come from that terrifying moment when we first crashed into each other. We've learned that love can grow from the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes the best relationships are built on a foundation of shared survival. People always react with shock when we tell them how we met, and I understand why it sounds like something that would traumatize people rather than bring them together. But for us, it was proof that we could handle anything life threw at us as long as we faced it together. We learned early on that we were the kind of people who would protect each other, and that knowledge has carried us through everything else. Sometimes the most intense circumstances reveal exactly who someone really is underneath all their social facades. And when you find someone whose character shines through in a crisis, you've found something special. Our final story tonight comes from someone who learned that love can be found in the most unexpected professional situations. I met my wife when we were both working as nurses, and we literally bonded over moving a dead body together, which sounds absolutely horrible when I say it out loud, but it was actually the moment I knew she was the person I wanted to spend my life with. This happened 4 years ago when I was working the overnight shift in the intensive care unit at a large hospital. I had been a nurse for about 6 years and thought I had seen everything, but working nights in the ICU meant dealing with death more frequently than I was comfortable with. We lost patients regularly, and part of the job was maintaining dignity and respect for families during the worst moments of their lives. Elena had just transferred to our unit from pediatrics and was still adjusting to the different pace and intensity of adult intensive care. She was incredibly skilled and compassionate, but I could tell she was struggling with how often we lost patients compared to her previous department, where most kids recovered and went home. We had been working together for about 3 weeks when we had a particularly difficult night. An elderly man who had been with us for 2 weeks finally passed away after a long battle with multiple organ failure. His family had been keeping vigil, and when he died, they were devastated but also relieved that his suffering was over. After the family said their goodbyes and left, it was Elena and my responsibility to prepare the body for transport to the morgue. This is always a solemn task that requires care and respect, but it was Elena's first time doing this in the ICU, and I could see she was nervous about the process. We worked together quietly and efficiently, wrapping the body and securing it for transport. When we were finished, we had to move the gurney from the room to the service elevator that would take it to the morgue. The hallways were dimly lit and empty, since it was 3 a.m, and our footsteps echoed in the silence. Halfway to the elevator, one of the wheels on the gurney got stuck, and we both had to maneuver it around a corner, while being careful not to disturb the body. Eleanor was concentrating so hard on doing everything perfectly that she didn't notice a wet floor sign that had been left in the hallway. She tripped over it and instinctively grabbed my arm to steady herself. For a moment we were both off balance, trying not to fall while also making sure the gurney stayed upright and stable. We managed to catch ourselves, but the whole situation was so absurd that Elena started giggling. It wasn't disrespectful laughter. It was the kind of nervous release that happens when you're trying to be serious, but life throws you a curveball. I started laughing too, and soon we were both trying to stifle our giggles while pushing a gurney through hospital corridors at 3 a.m. It was completely inappropriate and also completely human. We weren't laughing at death or at our patients, we were laughing at the ridiculous moment of almost falling over a wet floor sign while trying to do our jobs with dignity. When we got to the service elevator, Elena looked at me with tears in her eyes from laughing and said, "I can't believe I almost face-planted while moving a body on my first week in ICU." She was mortified, but also relieved, and I realised that her ability to find humour in even the darkest situations was exactly what made her such a good nurse. After we completed the transport, we went back to the break room for coffee and ended up talking for the rest of our shift. Elena told me about her previous job working with kids and how much she missed seeing patients get better and go home. I told her about my own struggles with the emotional weight of ICU work and how I had learned to find meaning in providing comfort during difficult times. What struck me about Elena that night was how she could hold space for both the sadness of losing a patient and the absurdity of almost tripping over a wet floor sign. She didn't try to pretend that the work wasn't hard or that she wasn't affected by it, but she also didn't let it crush her spirit. She found ways to be human, even in the most clinical situations. Over the next few months, Elena and I were often scheduled for the same shifts, and we developed this easy partnership. We worked well together, anticipating each other's needs and communicating without having to say much. We supported each other through difficult cases and celebrated small victories when patients improved. I started looking forward to the nights when Elena was working, not just because she made the job easier, but because she made everything more interesting. She had opinions about everything from hospital policies to the terrible coffee in the break room, and she wasn't afraid to share them. She was passionate about patient advocacy and had ideas for improving care that actually made sense. 6 months after the gurney incident, Elena and I were working together when we had an unusually quiet night with all our patients stable. We ended up talking for hours about our lives outside the hospital, our families, our dreams, our fears. I learned that Elena played guitar and wrote songs and that she had always wanted to travel to New Zealand. She learned that I collected vintage books and that I had been thinking about going back to school to become a nurse practitioner. That conversation felt different from our usual work banter. It was deeper and more personal, and I realised I was developing feelings for Eleanor that went beyond professional respect. I found myself thinking about her when I wasn't at work and looking for excuses to text her about hospital schedules or patient updates. A few weeks later, I finally worked up the courage to ask Elena if she wanted to have breakfast after our shift ended. She said yes immediately, and we went to this 24-hour diner that was popular with hospital staff. We talked until the sun came up, and I walked her to her car, feeling like I was floating. Our first official date was dinner at a restaurant, as far from the hospital as we could get. Elena wore a dress instead of scrubs, and I barely recognised her without her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked beautiful, but what I loved most was that she was still the same person who could find humour in the darkest situations and who cared deeply about making other people feel better. We've been together for 3 years now and got married last month. We had our wedding reception at the same diner where we had breakfast after our first date and invited all our co-workers from the hospital. Elena still writes songs, and I'm halfway through my nurse practitioner program, and we still work the same shifts whenever possible. People always ask us if it's hard to work together and be married, but for us it's the opposite. We've seen each other handle the most stressful situations imaginable, and we know we can count on each other no matter what happens. We've learned that the best partnerships are built on shared values and the ability to find light even in the darkest places. Every time we pass that spot in the hallway where Elena tripped over the wet floor sign, we smile at each other. It reminds us that love can grow from the most unexpected moments, and that sometimes the best relationships start with learning to laugh together, even when everything around you is serious. That story perfectly captures how shared experiences, especially the challenging ones, can create the strongest bonds between people. There's something beautiful about finding someone who can help you find lightness in even the heaviest moments. Well, that's all the romantic Reddit stories I have for you tonight. I hope these tales reminded you that love really can happen anywhere at any time, in the most unexpected ways, from psychiatric wards to grocery store parking lots to hospital hallways. These couples prove that there's no single right way to find your person. If you're still watching, and these stories made you believe in love again, or at least entertained you for the past hour, consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to have you along for more cozy storytelling sessions like this one. Thanks for spending your evening with me, and I'll see you in the next video.